And good afternoon, and thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to the Hackettstown Library to talk about the calendar year 1964. And thank you, everybody, for on a great day here in the New York City area. Low humidity, sun, low temperatures, and you're spending an hour or so with me, and thank you for doing so. 1964. 1964 is a rather interesting year. In fact, some of the things that you see that are going on or did go on following the George Floyd murder and the demonstrations happened in 1963, 64, 65, 66. And in some ways, not much has changed since 1964, but 1964 is the first year that the first baby boomers, the initial baby boomers born in 1946 become adults, and three of the more prominent baby boomers born in 1946 are Donald Trump, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, all born in 1964, all turning 18 during 1964 and becoming adults in 1964. And I think Bill Clinton's birthday was the other day. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, and racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. That was passed in July of 1964. And there is the picture of Lyndon Johnson in July of 1964 signing the Civil Rights Act into law. Right behind him is Martin Luther King Jr., or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as my old boss, Larry McCoy, at CBS Radio would say, you have to have the full name. And John Lindsay is back there too, and John Lindsay inadvertently got my radio career going at WNEW Radio in New York in 1978. And that was Lyndon Johnson changing the world at that point, or the world in the United States. On August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and that gave President Lyndon Johnson the ability to take any measures he wanted to retaliate against the North Vietnamese and to promote the maintenance of international peace and security in Southeast Asia. What it did was put the United States squarely into a war against North Vietnam, with Johnson going after Ho Chi Minh and sending all sorts of troops. There were advisors there in 1963, about 3,500 of them. It would become 500,000 men and women by 1968, fighting a war in Vietnam. And there is Lyndon Johnson addressing the nation, or about ready to address the nation about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It's also a summer of rioting. Riots in Newark, riots in Philadelphia, riots in Chicago, Jersey City, and other places throughout the United States. It doesn't seem too undissimilar, if there's such a word, than what we saw this year with, at that point, Negroes or Black Americans fighting for civil rights, fighting against what they thought was injustices. And there is Harlem, and you can see one of the riots going on in Harlem. That's around 125th Street. Fine cigar, Dutch Masters, Save Mart Television, radio store, Stetson hats, menswear, all in Harlem. And that looks more like a demonstration than a riot, but that's taking place in Harlem. As you can see, a New York City policeman right there. This is Rochester, New York. And this one, a guy gets hit on the side of the head, starts bleeding in Rochester, New York. Summer of discontent. In fact, so much so that J. Edgar Hoover was a little worried, as the head of the FBI, that the song Dancing in the Streets back in the 1960s, I think that was Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, and he thought that that was some sort of a code, that they'll be dancing in the streets, meaning rioting in the streets. Also, the FBI wanted to know the lyrics of Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. Something about that song got J. Edgar Hoover to think about something, and they spent a lot of money and time analyzing the song from 1963, Louie Louie. The Beatles arrive. That's at either JFK or Idlewild Airport. I'm not sure if they changed the name. That was February 7th, 1964. The British invasion takes hold. Cassius Clay, soon to become Muhammad X and Muhammad Ali, beats Sonny Liston to win the heavyweight championship of the world in 1964. And there's Fidel Castro, who fancied himself as a baseball player. Jose Valdivieso, who used to be on Channel 47, WNJU in the New York market, who had played with the Washington Senators. And I once had a discussion about Fidel Castro because Valdivieso had come from Cuba and was a Cuban exile, literally was a Cuban exile. He never went back after the revolution. Didn't like Castro. I said, what kind of guy was Castro as far as a baseball player? He said, they used to try out everybody. Anybody who owned a glove got a tryout for Major League Baseball with the Washington Senators. He was no prospect, none whatsoever, but he fancied himself as some sort of great baseball pitcher. He wasn't. He went into another business, obviously. There's Nikita Khrushchev. It would be the last year. Nikita Khrushchev holding either a hen or a chicken there. It would be the last year Khrushchev would be at the helm of the Soviet Union. Cyprus, their independence from British rule didn't work out all that well. They became an independent country in 1960. There was tension between the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. And by 1964, there was a civil war between the two paramilitary factions on the island. And there is a picture of what was going on over on the island there. And the World's Fair. New York City World's Fair, which was not an official World's Fair by the World's Fair Committee, but Robert Moses didn't care about official, non-official. He decided, let's have a World's Fair. And that was basically a testing ground for Walt Disney for what would become Walt Disney World in Orlando. He tried out some of what he wanted to do at the World's Fair in 1964 and 65. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 supposedly ended segregation in public places, banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And there is Martin Luther King getting one of the pens, and that is Lyndon Johnson, who had signed the act in July of 1964. Now, that was not the first Civil Rights Act ever passed in the United States. There were all kinds of Civil Rights Acts passed after the Civil War, which ended in 1865. A trio of constitutional amendments abolished slavery, made the former slave citizens, and gave all men, notice men, not women, all men. And I bring that up because the other day was the 100th anniversary for women, most women, to have the right to vote in the presidential election in 1920 with Warren G. Harding and James Cox. But it was all men. Women couldn't vote at that point. Susan B. Anthony was just pardoned the other day. And she dared to vote and got arrested in 1872. So it was all men had the right to vote. And there are politicians with one of the Civil Rights Acts shaking hands and thinking that they did a good job. Also, what happened was after, quote unquote, all men got the right to vote, many states, particularly in the South, used poll taxes, literacy taxes, and other measures to keep their African-American citizens essentially disenfranchised. There was no such thing as Jim Crow. Then all of a sudden, Jim Crow pops up in the 1870s. There was strict segregation policies through so-called Jim Crow laws. And there was violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. If you ever go to Indianapolis, Indiana, there are some, you know how those states have markers as to what happened in various places. In downtown Indianapolis, in front of the Indianapolis Star, there are markers where the Ku Klux Klan, the Indianapolis Star did the first stories on the Klan, where the Ku Klux Klan started in Indiana, and they decided in front of the Indianapolis Star building to put those signs talking about how the Ku Klux Klan started in Indiana after the Civil War. And there is the poll tax. There you go. You got to pay. You got to do something to vote. And that is the poll tax. And this cartoon is called The Georgetown Election, the Negro at the Ballot Box. And cartoons like this were around in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is extremely notable. In fact, a number of the things that went into the 1964 Act came out of the 1975 Act, the things that weren't part of it, that they fixed up in 1964. It's the last major piece of legislation related to the Reconstruction era that was passed by Congress, which included the Civil Rights Act of 1866, 4 Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868, 3 Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. This is already in the Grant administration. And 3 constitutional amendments adopted between 1865 during the Andrew Johnson administration and 1870 during Ulysses S. Grant's time as President of the United States. And there is Grant, President of the United States, but there is a problem. And the problem is the 1876 presidential election between the Democrat Sam Tilden from New York and the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. There was a dispute as to actually who won the 1876 election, Hayes or Tilden. So a compromise was reached. The Democrats said, okay, Rutherford B. Hayes, they told the Republicans, we'll accept you and accept your party, President of the United States, but this is what we want in exchange. The Democrats, particularly in the South, said, listen, take out the federal troops from the South. Grant home rule in the South. Let us run the South, and you can have the presidency. Hayes' withdrawal of federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina marks a major turning point in American political history. It effectively ended Reconstruction and replaced it with the system of Jim Crow. What Jim Crow did, well, simple. I'll give you a simple example. Water fountains. If you were white, you could drink out of that water fountain. But blacks could not drink out of the same water fountain. So they put 2 water fountains up. One for black men, one for white men. And white women also had different water fountains too, along with black women having different water fountains, depending where you were. You couldn't talk, if you were black, you couldn't talk to a white male on the street. That was an unofficial rule of the Jim Crow era. You knew where your place was. And there is Rutherford B. Hayes, the President of the United States, between 1877 and 1881. He was allowed to be president as long as nobody messed with the South. In fact, nobody did mess with the South. The compromise effectively ended the Reconstruction era. And the Southern Democrats promised to protect the civil and political rights of the blacks, but that wasn't kept. The end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to the disenfranchisement of black voters. If you had money, you were black, you could vote. Not too long ago, going back to 1964, citizens in some states had to pay a fee to vote in a national election. It was called a poll tax. On January 23rd, 1964, the United States ratified the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which said it prohibited any poll tax in elections for federal officials, meaning you were free to vote and didn't have to worry about paying for the right to vote. In 1883, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in civil rights cases that the Public Accommodations Act of the various civil rights acts, particularly the one of 1875, were unconstitutional. And they claimed, the justices, that Congress was not given the permission to control private persons or corporations under the Equal Protection Clause. That would come back in the 1964 version that Lyndon Johnson would sign. This is a museum in Mobile, Alabama. I was down in Mobile, Alabama in 2011, and we were on tour, and they have Mardi Gras. It's a Mardi Gras museum, but it also is a museum which had relics of the South. And one of the relics of the South was you're going into a place, you were black, Negro, colored entrance only. That's where you went. You couldn't go in where the white people went into a building. And there's the water fountain. There's the colored water fountain. White women, colored women that way. White men, colored men that way to the men's room. So separate bathrooms, separate water fountains in the South. By the 1950s and the 1960s, Rosa Parks, of course, with the Montgomery bus lines, there were protests in the streets. And the protests really started in 1963 in earnest after the Birmingham, after police in Birmingham had dogs go after demonstrators, and John Kennedy saw it on TV and decided it was time to do something. What the something was, he gave a speech. The guy who got literally the ball against over the goal line was Lyndon Johnson. But the 1963, actually there were freedom riders in 1961, but 63, it really ramped up. 64, the Civil Rights Act is passed, but the problems don't go away. Now, a couple of the landmark decisions in the past: Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, landmark 1954 Supreme Court case. The justices ruled unanimously racial segregation of children in public schools unconstitutional. And by 1957, these women ended up in a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was the governor of the state of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, who called in the Arkansas National Guard to block the black students' entry into a high school in the city, Central High, September 4th, 1957. Eisenhower would get involved by sending federal National Guard there to make sure that the 9 people went to school. They were called the Little Rock 9. Federal troops escorted them into the school, and it drew national attention to the civil rights movement. And there is Ike talking with some of the leaders of the civil rights movement at that time. Civil Rights Act of 1957, protection of voter rights, set out in the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice empowered federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the rights of protesters. A Civil Rights Commission within the executive branch with the authority to investigate discriminatory conditions and recommend corrective means. But it was only temporary. It was not supposed to last, the Civil Rights Act of 57. And the purpose of the bill: get registered black voters in the South. And in the South, only 20% of registered voters were, of blacks were registered voters. The Republicans were, or actually blacks voted with Republicans up until the civil rights movement. So politically, it was good for the Republicans to sign up more black voters because they voted as a black Republican. That changed later on for Democrats. So actually, they were since Roosevelt did, but at that point, the Republicans had the black vote. Jackie Robinson was a Republican. That switched to, by the Civil Rights Act, Democrats. And as Lyndon Johnson said, he handed white voters to the Republicans in 1964 by signing the Civil Rights Act. And there is Eisenhower signing the 57 bill into law. And basically it was federal inspection of local voter registration polls by appointed referees to oversee Southern elections to ensure that African Americans were permitted to vote. Penalties for anyone who obstructed someone's attempt to register to vote or vote. It extended the life of the Civil Rights Commission. That was only 2 years. And prosecution for interfering with court orders regarding school segregation. John Kennedy comes into the picture after being elected president in 1960. On June 11th, 1963, Kennedy pays attention to the civil rights movement after seeing dogs unleashed on protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. On May 1st, 1963, he seeks legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. And as I said, he was moved to take action following what he saw in Birmingham, Alabama. And there is Lyndon Johnson, finally, in July of 1964, getting this thing done. Civil Rights Act, this is how it officially reads: barred unequal application of voter registration requirements, outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in motels, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations, prohibited state and municipalities from denying access to public facilities on grounds of race, color, religion, or national origin, encouraged desegregation of public schools, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to file suits enforcing the act, expanded the Civil Rights Commission established by the Civil Rights Act of 1957, prevented discrimination by government agencies that received federal funding. And here are 6 titles: voting rights, public accommodations, desegregation of public facilities, desegregation of public education, Commission on Civil Rights, non-discrimination in federally assisted programs, except in education for women. Discrimination still took place in 1964 after the Civil Rights Movement, or civil rights legislation is signed by Johnson. It would take 8 years to close that hole in the Civil Rights Act. It would be the Title IX legislation of 1972, signed into law by Richard Nixon, which gave women equal opportunity to education, higher education, if a place took federal funding. It took 8 more years for women to catch up to the Civil Rights Movement. And there is Martin Luther King receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his demonstrations in the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to this point in 1964. Martin Luther King said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was nothing less than the second emancipation. But while that's going on, this is going on. This again is Harlem, police with billy clubs and demonstrators. Segregationists who were angered by the Civil Rights Movement also took to the streets, and they attacked African-American demonstrators across the South. And these are three guys who went down to the South and decided to help out with the Civil Rights Movement, one of them from Pelham, New York. Michael Schwerter, who is from Pelham, and Andrew Goodman, both white New Yorkers, traveled to the heavy segregated Mississippi in 1964 to help civil rights efforts on behalf of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. The third man, James Chaney, and you saw all three of them in that last picture, was a local African-American man who joined CORE in 1963. On June 21st, they disappeared. Their bodies were found on August 4th. On June 21st, 2005, 41 years after the anniversary of the 3 murders, an 80-year-old man named Edgar Ray Killen was found guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter. And there is a, if you go to Pelham High School in Pelham, New York, there is a little memorial that has been set up to remember Michael Schwerter and his role in the civil rights movement and being killed in Mississippi. Decades of police brutality kept off several incidences, rioting in the summer of 1964, and historians are kind of split about was it rioting or was it an insurrection in 1964. But there was rioting in 1964 in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Jersey City. The United States was not the only country going through this. That is South Africa, apartheid, white area. If you were black, you couldn't swim on the beach. Biloxi, Mississippi, if you were black, you couldn't swim on the beach either until 1968, 1960. There was not necessarily a riot, but there were problems on the beach in Biloxi, Mississippi. People were beaten up, people were arrested. It took 8 years to fix that up. South Africa, 1964, apartheid was going on. The South Africans were thrown out of the Olympics movement in 1964 because of apartheid. Please boycott apartheid sport. Well, that happened in 1964. August 18th, South Africa banned from the Olympics. They were banned in taking part in the Tokyo Olympics because the government refused to condemn apartheid. The first demonstrations are starting against Lyndon Johnson in 1964. College demonstrations would not start until 1967. Johnson is a war criminal. No destruction in Vietnam. Why were the Americans in Vietnam? Well, it had something to do with something called the domino theory. The domino theory, if South Vietnam fell, then Cambodia would fall, then Laos would fall, then Thailand would fall. There was a civil war, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. The French controlled Vietnam and walked away from it, leaving the two sides to combat each other. In the late 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, Vietnam split into two, the communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam. There were the Cold War anxieties of that period between the Soviet Union and the United States, and even the Soviet Union, and if you remember how it was called, Red China or Communist China. Now, the Cold War anxieties dictated that if the North Vietnamese communists prevailed, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes, and the whole area would become communist, which means you'd have communist Soviet Union, China, and Southeast Asia. When John Kennedy took office in 1961, he vowed that he would not allow South Vietnam to fall to communism. John Kennedy and the Kennedy administration by 1963 were becoming disillusioned with Diem, who was the head of South Vietnam at that point. He would be assassinated. Diem would be assassinated in November of 1963 after a military coup of sorts, and Kennedy would be killed about 3 weeks later. There is Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara had no business being the Secretary of Defense. He was a guy who was a bean counter at the Ford Motor Company. But John Kennedy brought him into his administration and made him the Secretary of Defense. And again, he had no business being there. But McNamara approved a lot of the plans that were drawn up to defend South Vietnam and defeat the North Vietnamese. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was prompted by two maybe separate attacks on two U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. One occurred August 2nd, one on August 4th. Whether there was an attack on the second boat is still a matter of conjecture. Two destroyers were stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin in waters that separated North Vietnam from the Chinese island of Hainan. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Lyndon Johnson had the permission to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. August 7th, 1964, the United States enters a protracted war with North Vietnam. According to the Navy, the Maddox and the Turner Joy reported being fired upon by the North Vietnamese and patrol boats, but doubts about the second attack emerged. Something happened out there, but it may not have been an attack on the Turner Joy. The escalation of American involvement in the Vietnam Civil War starts. 3,500 men become 500,000 men and women. And there is Lyndon Johnson after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. In January of 1965, 5,400 men were called up for the draft. By December of that year, 45,000 men were called. The monthly draft rose from 17,000 a month to 35,000 a month in 1966, and young people across the country would begin engaging in civil disobedience, and the apex of that would be in 1969. There is Nikita Khrushchev, and there is Leonid Brezhnev. Fancy chapeaus, I would say. One looks like a fedora, one looks like a exaggerated or small top hat. Back in the USSR, October 15th, 1964, the premier Nikita Khrushchev was removed from office, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. There is Kennedy and Khrushchev, and of course they had their problems in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they both backed down. Both of them pretty much backed down. Kennedy and Khrushchev did come to some sort of an agreement where Kennedy would remove nukes from Turkey and Khrushchev wouldn't put nukes into Cuba. And there was Khrushchev with Fidel Castro, a very young-looking Fidel Castro back in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev deployed nuclear missiles in the newly formed communist, wasn't that new, it's 2 years old at that point, but it was communist Cuba, within easy striking distance of Miami and other population centers. The United States knew the missiles were only partially developed and really didn't impose an immediate threat. Khrushchev backed down in negotiations with the Kennedy administration, removed missiles from Cuba. But it was an even deal, so to speak. Quid pro quo, I think, is the Latin for it, because John Kennedy, who actually tried to invade the Bay of Cuba through the Bay of Pigs invasion and try to get rid of Cuba, said, I will not attack Cuba, and he decided to take American nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Pro quo, I believe it's called. And there is Nikita Khrushchev in better days with Mao Zedong. They didn't get along. The Chinese dictator had some strong words about Khrushchev, who decided that he wanted to play ball with the West, particularly the United States. Starting around 1960s, the two countries started calling each other names. Khrushchev said Mao was a left revisionist who failed to comprehend modern warfare. Meanwhile, Mao criticized Khrushchev as a psalm-singing buffoon. He was a psalmist, I guess, a psalm-singing buffoon who underestimated the nature of Western imperialism. This would go on for about a decade. Of course, Khrushchev was gone, replaced by Brezhnev, but in 1969, Brezhnev had enough of Mao and threatened to nuke the place. Mao was looking at the 1968 elections, hoping Richard Nixon would win and maybe, just maybe, open up the door to a relationship with the United States. And there is Khrushchev eventually sitting on a park bench, thrown out of office, left to write his memoirs. The break with China, with the Soviet Union, and food shortages, remember they were always going through that 5-year agricultural plan that never seemed to materialize, eroded Khrushchev's legacy in the eyes of the other high-ranking Soviet officials in the Politburo, and they were bothered by what they saw as his erratic tendency to undercut their authority, the Politburo's authority. And there is Brezhnev on the cover of Life magazine. The takeover in the Kremlin, Russia's new leader. It was really the Soviet Union's new leader, not Russia. The Soviet people, according to Brezhnev, see their international duty in the support of the just struggle of people against imperialism. That would be South Vietnam, among others. Colonialism, some countries in Africa, and neo-colonialism for their social and national liberation, for peace, democracy, national independence, and socialism. We are coming out for an end to the arms race. Let's end that with the United States. For the general and complete disarmament, for relieving the peoples from the mounting burden of military expenditures. It would be the military expenditures that would ultimately bring down the Soviet Union about 25 years, well, no, let's make it about, 25 years after Brezhnev takes office. And there is Ho Chi Minh. He's in Hanoi. November 17th, the Cold War heats up. The Soviet Politburo decides to increase its support to North Vietnam. The aid includes aircraft, radar, artillery, air defense systems, small arms, ammunition, food and medical supplies. Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese would be fighting a proxy war against the Americans for the Soviets. And there are some more troops in Cyprus. Fighting between ethnic Turks and Greeks heats up. 16 people are dead. The island's two main ethnic groups started fighting in 1963. By 1964, the United Nations sent in a 7,000 strong peacekeeping force to make sure the two sides would not erupt into violence. Lyndon Johnson, he turns his attention to this particular little war, and he wants to head off further inflammation of the crisis, and he tells Turkey, hey, listen, don't think about it. Any rash moves, we're going to have somebody's back in Cyprus, and it ain't going to be yours. And there are the troops. By August 10th, 1964, the United Nations does get in there, brokers another ceasefire in Cyprus, and that diffused the crisis for the time being. But there would still be embers lighting up over years and years and years and years. But for 1964, it's put to bed. And there's Nelson Mandela. He's sentenced to jail. He's a troublemaker in South Africa, absolute troublemaker. He's sentenced to jail June 12, 1964. He gets a life sentence for committing sabotage against the apartheid government of South Africa, but he was not given a death sentence. The Beatles, Paul, George, John in that picture on the Ed Sullivan Show with Ringo on the drum kit. The Beatles come to America on February 7th, 1964 with a couple of big hits. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You. They're on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th. But that was not their first American TV appearance. Oddly enough, their first American TV appearance came on November 22nd, 1963. The day that John Kennedy was killed, there was a video about Beatlemania on the Mike Wallace CBS morning show. On the evening, on Cronkite's show, there was supposed to be the same package that Cronkite was supposed to show. It is alleged that Walter Cronkite tipped Ed Sullivan off about the Beatles. That was the allegation. But the Beatles come over, and on February 9th, 1964, 73 million Americans gather around the TV to watch old Stoneface, Ed Sullivan, and here they are, the Beatles. And people watched the Beatles perform on Ed Sullivan, and they sold themselves to the American audience. And there is old Ed with Ringo and George. George looks kind of, well, what am I here for? And John, like, we got the world by you-know-what, and Paul laughing at him. And George looks kind of perplexed. And there's my friend Bob Lipsyte. Rachel probably has in the library Bob Lipsyte's book, The Accidental Sports Writer. Bob Lipsyte was who I've known for a very, very long time. In fact, it was Bob Lipsyte who coined the phrase jockocracy, talking about athletes getting special privileges in, say, the TV business or other things, which, how it goes, Sal, appropriated and used for himself. But it was Bob Lipsyte who came up with that saying. Lipsyte is in Miami covering the Yankees in Fort Lauderdale in spring training. He gets a call from his sports editor at the New York Times, and they say, Bob, we want you to go to the 5th Street Gym in Miami, Angelo Dundee's place. And the Beatles are meeting Cassius Clay. So why don't you go file something? And Lipsyte says, okay, I'll go. So he goes down there, and it's on February 18th. And Bob Lipsyte in his book, and has told me that it was worlds colliding on February 18th, 1964. And they were young worlds. It was the worlds of the Beatles, who were a 9-day wonder in the United States at that point, and Cassius Clay, a big mouth heavyweight contender going after the Bear, Sonny Liston. and he was trying to win the heavyweight championship of the world. His lip side has said in retrospect, what if the Beatles flopped, and what if Cassius Clay never beat Sonny Liston? It would just be a day for me that I would remember and nobody else would remember. But it didn't happen that way. Lipside goes down to the gym and he's put in a room, and soon afterwards the four Beatles are put in the same room. It is only Lipside and the four Beatles. And he said three of the Beatles were really nice to him: Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. But John Lennon was on edge. Why was he on edge? Well, part of it was that he didn't like Cassius Clay. Didn't like Cassius Clay at all. His guy was Sonny Liston. And John Lennon did not associate with losers. Cassius Clay was a loser. Sonny Liston was a winner, but the Beatles couldn't get an audience with Sonny Liston. They could with Cassius Clay. February 18th, 1964, the worlds collide, the worlds of young people. And there is the bear, Sonny Liston, the baddest man on the planet. He did some prison time, and he was like Mike Tyson in a way. Everybody was afraid of him until they weren't. And the Beatles are stuck in the room with Lipside for a half hour. Finally, after a half hour, and Lennon is cooling his heels, angry at the world, they come out and they meet Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay looks at them and says, "Who are those four sissy boys?" But the cameras went on, the red lights went on, the photographers started to snap, and showbiz. These guys never met each other. Showbiz kicks in. Ringo goes on Cassius Clay's back. He's carrying him around. They're having a good old time, and these pictures are taken, and they both go their separate ways afterwards. The Beatles, wherever they're going in Miami, Ed Sullivan Show taping would be coming up, and Cassius Clay training for his bout against Sonny Liston. Lipside said everything worked out for both of them. And there is me and Muhammad Ali. That is in May of 1985. And Ali, at that point, the Parkinson's had really kicked in. That was 21 years later. Also about 60,000 punches to the head in boxing matches and sparring sessions. And there is Ali and me in 1983, and the guy with the mustache is Bob Traynor. We're doing an interview with Muhammad Ali in 1963 on the 25th anniversary of the World Boxing Council, and I'm asking him a question at that point. Angelo Dundee had the gym where Cassius Clay trained for his fight with Sonny Liston in 1964, the Fifth Street Gym, which is long gone in Miami. Lennon never really gave up his love for Sonny Liston. I'll tell you that in a minute. There's my son when he was 9 years old at Angelo Dundee's gym. Actually, that's 1995, so he's 10 years old with Angelo Dundee at the gym. And Dundee told me all kinds of stories about the Beatles meeting Cassius Clay, who was Cassius' X at the time, and then Muhammad X and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali never changed his name legally. He didn't have to in 1964. The New York Times referred to him until 1970 as Cassius Clay. That was Abe Rosenthal, who ran the New York Times in those days into the 1980s. And there's Malcolm X, who was Cassius Clay's mentor. Cassius Clay became a really scary character after he beat Sonny Liston, because on March 6, 1964, the Nation of Islam leader Muhammad Ali announced that the new heavyweight champion of the world would no longer be called Cassius Clay. "This Clay name has no meaning," said Elijah Muhammad in a radio address. "Muhammad Ali is what I will give him as long as he believes in Allah and follows me." Eventually, Muhammad Ali would have a falling out with Elijah Muhammad. Many newspapers did not want to call Muhammad Ali Muhammad Ali. The New York Times editor, A. Rosenthal, was emphatic about it was Cassius Clay until he changes his name in the court of law. That was according to Robert Lipside. Ali never really changed his name legally, but until the 1960s, there were no laws requiring you to do so. So he was named as Muhammad Ali. The New York Times, September 18, 1970, state, that would be Georgia, State will grant Clay ring license. It's when Muhammad Ali came back to fight Jerry Quarry in Georgia because there was no Georgia State Boxing Commission. There was no need for a license, but that was the headline. State will grant Clay. This is the New York Times. All the news that's fit to print. 6 years after, state will grant Clay ring license. The Beatles, they were part of the civil rights movement because they were supposed to perform on September 11th, rain or shine, in Jacksonville at the Gaither Bowl. And a few days beforehand, they found out that it was going to be a segregated crowd. And the Beatles as a group, all four of them, who valued Motown, who valued Chuck Berry, and valued Little Richard, said, this is going to be segregated. And this caused a problem in the Jim Crow South. Johnson, of course, passed the law 2 months earlier. But the promoters were feeling the heat because the Beatles were the number one box office in showbiz at the time. They gave in. The Beatles played before a desegregated crowd. It was the only time they performed in Florida. If you throw out the Ed Sullivan tapings, they wanted to cancel September 11th. They issued a statement: "We will not appear unless Negroes are allowed to sit anywhere." They won. Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was never forgotten by John Lennon. If you look at the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Club album cover, the guy in the bathrobe or the boxing robe to the, I guess, right, to your left, of the wax dummy Beatles is Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston made it to the cover. Muhammad Ali didn't. And there is the wax mock-up of Sonny Liston for the Beatles album. Lennon eventually would get together. Lennon did two things, actually. In 1973, Ringo Starr recorded his song called "I'm the Greatest." Of course, Muhammad Ali's line was, "I'm the greatest." Lennon felt he couldn't sing that song, but he gave it to Ringo to sing because nobody thought Ringo was the greatest. But this is Jimmy Carter's inaugural in 1977 with John Lennon and Muhammad Ali and Yoko Ono. Sonny Liston had been dead for about 9 years at this point. New York World's Fair. It's a picture of me and my wife a couple of years ago at the World's Fair at the renovated Unisphere, done by USS Steel for the 1964 World's Fair. Peace through understanding. 650 acres of land in Flushing Meadows. There were pavilions, public spaces, displays from exhibitors from around the world, countries, cities, and corporations. This was the first ever corporate World's Fair. Kodak was there, Firestone was there, US Steel was there, Ford Motor Company was there, Disney was there. Disney was there taking notes on things that Walt Disney set up. Private groups set up shop. They displayed their ideas, accomplishments to more than 50 million visitors over 2 years. That's about 20 million short of what Robert Moses, the guy who put together the World's Fair and a lot of other things in New York, thought would show up. But the corporate showed up and they sold their wares. Like I said, it was the first corporate World's Fair that was ever held. And there is the World's Fair. That street is still there. And that is Lyndon Johnson walking there along with Lady Bird. And you can still go down that street to the Unisphere. It leads out today to the US Open facilities in Flushing Meadows with the US Open stadiums. If they kept walking, they'd walk right into what was once Louis Armstrong Stadium. But by the end of 1964 session, the World's Fair was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they sold tickets for 1965 and used that to pay off the 1964 debt. The fair did manage to run its full schedule in 1965. That is the New York Pavilion, which has been laying there dormant except for one movie, The Men in Black, which used it. There are people in New York State trying to renovate that building to what its former glory, except I'm not sure what its former glory was. There used to be cows in there, the Holsteins from upstate New York, and you used to be able to go up those towers to look at the Grand Central Parkway and the Long Island Expressway, if that's what you wanted to look at. Along the way on the Grand Central Parkway, you could sneak in there. Some people used oil barrels or garbage barrels to climb over the fence. Others just went under the fence to get into the World's Fair for the day. And they're going to restore that thing. That thing was built in 1964. It is totally decayed, but they're restoring it. This is where Disney is working. There are a couple areas where Disney is working. This is the Illinois Pavilion, and they came up with this robot to be Abe Lincoln, and this would become the basis of the Hall of Presidents, which would be on the Disney property. So Walt Disney did that. And he also did It's a Small World. That was created for the 1964 World's Fair. My daughter hated in Disney World when she went on It's a Small World. She just didn't want to go on it. This was all overseen by Walt Disney, and he got support of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and it was a huge attraction at the fair. That one was eventually shipped to the Disneyland Park, where it opened in 1966, and there's a small world also at Disney World down in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. So Disney actually used this for his other amusement parks. This is the Alaska, the Anchorage 1964 Easter earthquake, largest earthquake ever measured. I was in Anchorage in 2006. There was in 2006 still damage from this earthquake in Anchorage. It was 5:36 in the evening on March 27th. That would be 11:36 in New York, and I actually watched that on Channel 2 News at 11:36. I was not even 8 years old, but I never kept any regular hours other kids kept. The shake was 4 minutes. There were tsunamis and landslides, and it was the biggest earthquake in U.S. history. The Warren Report came out, the official report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. People didn't believe it. They still think there are conspiracy theories out there that have never been solved. In fact, Congress looked into some of them in the 1970s, but the Warren Commission still stands. It was presented to Lyndon Johnson on September 24th, 1964, 10 months after the assassination in Dallas of John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. It goes public on September 27th of 64, and the report concluded that the gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. There was an unknown motive, they never could figure it out, and that Jack Ruby acted alone in killing Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters. Now, Ruby used to be able to get in there because he owned a strip joint. Everybody knew him, and he just had a free reign walking in and out of the police department. And Ruby decided, you know what, I'm going to take this guy out for the good of the country. People have doubted the report. There are conspiracy theories. You go to Dallas, you go to Daily Square, and there are people who will hand out newspapers with all kinds of theories, books with all kinds of theories. The New Orleans DA would eventually have his theory, Jim Garrison, and it just all kind of fell apart. Maybe we'll never know what happened, but pretty soon a lot of papers will be unsealed. It's been, what, 57 years. So in 18 years, some of those papers that were sealed for 75 years, hoping that people would all be dead by the time the papers would come out, will be unsealed. So maybe there are some mysteries that will be unveiled at that point. Barry Goldwater was running for president against Lyndon Johnson. He was critical of Johnson's liberal domestic policies, railed against the welfare programs, defended his own decision to vote against the Civil Rights Act, passed by Congress earlier that year. And he seemed to suggest, and I never asked Jack Kemp about this, the former Buffalo Bill quarterback, who also was a congressman from Western New York, who I got to know over the years, and he was a Goldwater guy in 1964. He was out on the campaign stump when he wasn't playing football with the Buffalo Bills. And I never asked him about that. But Goldwater seemed to suggest that, yeah, maybe I could drop a nuke on Cuba in Havana, or maybe a nuke on Hanoi or Haiphong to achieve U.S. objectives. But that's what Goldwater was painted as. And he was painted as a radical in what would be that commercial, which may be the most famous political commercial ever made in the United States. It's the Daisy commercial, with the girl picking the daisy out with a voice in the background talking about Barry Goldwater. Johnson defeated Goldwater, 60% of the vote, and he turned back the conservative senator and got his first full term in office after succeeding to the presidency following the assassination of JFK. Now, under the rules, if you serve less than 2 years for a sitting president taking over after the president's death or being disabled in some matter, you have those less than 2 years, and then you could run for 2 full terms as president of the United States. And Martin Luther King, as I said, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his nonviolent resistance to racial prejudice in the United States. He was 35 years old at the time. Dr. King was the youngest person ever to receive the award. And Sidney Poitier made history, movie history, in 1964, because on April 13th, 1964, Sidney Poitier became the first Black performer in a leading role to win an Academy Award for his performance in Lilies of the Field. Now, I have not done this talk in person yet because I put it together during the pandemic, but I wonder if any of you know who this woman is, because she became a really big star in the late 1970s and early 80s in TV. And if you want to type it into the chat box, you could do that. I'll give you a couple seconds. She became a big star on what probably was the biggest TV show of the late 1970s, early 1980s. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. If you remember the show Dallas, and you remember J.R. Ewing, that is his wife, and I don't know the character's name because I never watched Dallas. That is his wife in the show, Linda Gray. Linda Gray was a high fashion model in the 1960s, and she is the one who has the black eyes. Us Tarryton smokers would rather fight than switch. If you remember the commercials, they were somewhat violent. You'd see people pushing and shoving for Tarrytown commercials. Get the filter cigarette with the taste worth fighting for, the unswitchables. They were not only advocating taking something which by 1964 was proven that could give you cancer, but they were also advocating physical violence if you took their cigarette away. Us Tarrytown smokers would rather fight than switch. That is Linda Gray. And I bring that up because the Surgeon General in 1964 ruled that cancer, or rather cigarettes, was the cause of lung cancer and laryngeal cancer in men, probable cause of lung cancer in women, the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. And that was January 11th, 1964. My friend Bruce Morton is in here. At the end, Bruce does a cancer care YouTube thing. Now, I'm going to give him a minute so he can tell you about that, about cancer care. Not about cigarettes, but I'll do that for about a minute. Anyway, that was January 11th, 1964, when the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health said cigarettes could cause cancer. I will end with this. That was the week that was. I was 7 years old, and I absolutely adored this show. Unfortunately, there are only about 3 or 4 American segments of this show on YouTube. It was a satirical review. It was the father of the Smothers Brothers show, the father of Rowan and Martin's Laughing, the father of Saturday Night, the father of Saturday Night Live, the father of The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. It was done both in England and in the United States. First in England, then comes over to NBC in 1964. David Frost was the host of both the shows in the United States and in England on the BBC. And there you're looking at Nancy Ames, the TW3 girl, among the people who are part of the show. Okay, how's that? We back? We back? Okay, did you get the 3WE? That was the week that was. Because if not, I'll tell it back to you. That was the week that was in England. So Graham Chapman and John Cleese were Frost's writers, part of the show. And the BBC, the TW3 song, the BBC version of the show received many, many, many complaints. Lord Eldington, the vice chairman of the Conservative Party, wrote to the BBC Director General Hugh Green that David Frost had a hatred of the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, that he finds impossible to control. The program also attracted complaints from the Boy Scout Association about an item questioning the sexuality of its founder, Lord Baden-Powell. Years later, there are still questions abound about the Boy Scouts of America. That was the week that was. It's over. Let it go. Oh, what a week that was. That was the week that was. And that was the year that was. People walked around with hairstyles like that. Combination of a beehive haircut. And it looks like a chandelier on the right on that woman. The Vietnam War was started in 1964 as far as the Americans were concerned. Civil rights struggles in the United States continued. There was Beatlemania and Muhammad Ali, a civil war in Cyprus, and a change in the USSR. It was the first year that the baby boomers, born in 1946, became adults and went off to college. The New York World's Fair opened. The world was changing, and the events of 1964 impacted people well into the 21st century, into the year 2020. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. I hope that you enjoyed a stroll down in the 1964 era and prior to that, going back to the end of the Civil War. And smoking, of course, was deemed as dangerous. And I'm going to let Bruce here. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself for a second because I did talk about cancer. And you do a thing and you kind of need a little help with it. And they may be able to help you.
All right, Evan, thanks very much. And thanks for the presentation. 1964 was the year that I was in 6th grade. So a couple of years ahead of you as far as that goes. And thanks for giving me a chance to talk about my website podcast. It's called cancerinterviews.com. And basically what we do is we do interviews with people who are cancer survivors. And it gives them a chance to explain their cancer journey, what their life was like before they were diagnosed with cancer, becoming diagnosed, and how they eventually survived cancer. And we have this website because a lot of times when people are diagnosed with cancer, They go to the internet or they go to healthcare professionals to determine the best treatment option. But what often gets overlooked is that there's a whole emotional piece with this part of their life as they look forward to confronting something that is quite enormous. And the people that we speak to are people who did confront something with that enormity, and they beat it. And we have found from people who have viewed the website that it is quite helpful to them in their cancer journey. So if you know someone who has been diagnosed or think that they might be diagnosed, you might want to pass along our web address to them so they can hear from the uplifting stories from other people. Once again, it's one word, Cancer Interviews. That's www.cancerinterviews.com. And thanks, Evan.
And you're still looking for people to like your YouTube channel?
Yes, please. Thank you for bringing that up. If you go to our homepage, www.cancerinterviews.com, in the upper right-hand corner, there are icons for various social media platforms, and one of them is for YouTube. And you could help us out in a very big way, and it would only take a second if you click on the YouTube icon, which is in the middle of the 5 of them. And then once you get to the YouTube page, there's a button that says subscribe. And if you hit subscribe, it helps us a great deal. It doesn't cost you a cent. You will not have bought anything, and you won't be getting any unsolicited emails. But it will help us as it moves us toward our goal of getting 100 subscribers. And once we do, then YouTube will gift us with our own personalized link. Right now, our link is like 37 different numbers, letters, and punctuation marks.
Okay, Bruce, thank you.
Thanks again, Evan.
Yeah, and anybody else, Kathy, anybody else have anything to say? Sue? Okay, well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for inviting me again to Hackettstown, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and we will see you somewhere down the road again.